Hey, Dr. Freeman, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Scott. Thanks for inviting me on your podcast.
Excited to have you here. And this topic of mental health on the entrepreneurial journey is one that I am well versed in, and I know that you are as well. Maybe to frame things up, it would be great if you could just give the audience a little bit of background on you.
Reader's Digest version. I am a psychiatrist and an entrepreneur. I've founded or co-founded 4 or 5 companies over the years. And with my psychiatric training, I began to observe among my fellow co-founders and founders that there were some kind of distinctive mental health issues that popped up. After I made that observation, I rounded up some of my research colleagues at UC San Francisco. I have been affiliated over there over the years as I was a clinical professor of psychiatry for many years in that department. And with my research colleagues, we have done some large studies about the entrepreneur mental health journey and have discovered that, in fact, there actually are real issues and that these issues are different for entrepreneurs than they are for managers or job holders. Currently, I am most interested in trying to create scalable mental health solutions for entrepreneurs just because the mental health system itself is so defective and there's so many shortages of providers everywhere.
Well, we appreciate the work that you have done, and it doesn't really surprise me that mental health is somewhat of a unique issue for entrepreneurs. You mentioned some studies and some information that you have uncovered about some of the distinct differences. Can you share more on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. But just first at the gut level, because you're not surprised and nobody else is once I make a statement like that, just think about what kind of person is attracted into entrepreneurship. You know, if you zoom out and think about it, pretty much anybody can hold a job. Many people can lead a team or a club or an organization, but very, very few people can start and grow a business. So what is it about those people that want to be entrepreneurs? And, you know, when you talk to entrepreneurs, even when their companies are failing, they do not want to go back and into the workforce and get a job somewhere. It's a distinct sensibility about work. In fact, if you talk with a lot of entrepreneurs about their work, some of them will tell you that they don't work. It's not work. It's just, this is like it's passion. It's what they do. Remembering one time as a psychiatrist, you know, all of my patients are entrepreneurs. And I've had about 6,000 or more, maybe 7,000 now, hours of providing direct clinical care to entrepreneurs. And one guy I asked, when I heard about his life over the last several years, I asked him if he ever took a vacation. And he thought about it for a minute because he knew that I knew what the true answer was. So he looked at me and he said, "Everything about my life is a vacation." And that's not so inaccurate from the way at least some entrepreneurs perceive it. So to answer your question, what are the differences? Well, first of all, what kind of people are attracted into entrepreneurship? People that have both a high need for autonomy and independence, people who are self-confident and believe that if they don't know something, they can figure it out. People who are able to tolerate taking risks. You know, most people are risk averse, but entrepreneurs are the opposite. Entrepreneurs are almost risk-seeking, thrill-seeking, excitement-seeking, novelty-seeking. People who are creative and can envision solutions to problems that other people can't think up. People who are outgoing good enough communicators that they can get other people excited about what they're doing and develop a team and find their way into customers and suppliers and investors. So those are some of the personal characteristics. Those characteristics happen to be superpowers that are associated with mental health issues. And so when you talk about the mental health of entrepreneurs, you want to look at the superpowers and the vulnerabilities as all part of a big package.
So to be specific, so those things that make a good entrepreneur also potentially make one more vulnerable to some of the challenges of mental health. Is that kind of what you meant there?
That's what I meant there. So the guy who never took a vacation because life is a vacation is compulsive. He's a compulsive workaholic. And being compulsive is part of a mental health condition. There's a name for it. And it's treatable. And it does bleed over into addiction. You know, there's different kinds of behavioral addictions. Some people even think that entrepreneurship addiction is a real thing. In other words, people who can't stop starting new companies. They're like, they're in this literature, they're addicted to starting more and more companies. And there's even a diagnostic test available. You can find it online to find out whether or not you have entrepreneurship addiction. So various variations on the theme of addiction, variations on the theme of compulsivity, variations on the theme of mood. It's very emotional, the roller coaster, as I believe you discovered for yourself. Variations on the theme of impulsivity, because you got to make quick decisions without complete information. So in some instances, that's a good thing, but too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. That's kind of the framework that I look at it in.
Well, some of those definitely reign true and near and dear to my own heart and experience. And you know, one thing I kind of thing that came up for me as you were describing some of the things, such as, you know, I'm addicted to starting companies and every day feels like play. You talk to a lot of people, and they probably, especially the people that have those preferences or perceived preferences, and they would say, well, isn't that a good thing? I mean, isn't starting a lot of companies a good thing? Isn't throwing myself into work a good thing and loving it relative to alternatives? And I guess I would be curious to get your perspective on that.
You know, it's a good thing, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing. In the academic literature on entrepreneurship, and there is a pretty robust academic literature. There are researchers that study this in good universities around the world. There's a famous article called "The Downside of Being Up," and that, I think, captures the issue. For example, I got an email yesterday from a woman in Silicon Valley. She and her husband started a business. It's a very successful business. They're married, and they have a 4-year-old child. And the email was to the effect of, what should I do? My husband has become more and more and more addicted to work. Now he got addicted to porn. Then he started having problems with social media overuse. And now it's kind of bleeding over into drugs and alcohol. So is it a good thing that this guy and his wife started a business? Absolutely. They are improving the standard of living for their own family, and they have created, you know, dozens and dozens of jobs, and they're paying taxes to the state of California, and they're creating products and services that improve the quality of life of customers. So you can't really argue with that, but you can see how it kind of got out of control, and she doesn't want to get divorced, but she's worried about the welfare of the kid and her husband. So what do you do? So that's just one example of the general principle that most of these are good things, but too much of a good thing can become a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. I can totally relate to that, and the idea that it's not a problem until it's a problem,
That's right.
and
Hmm.
and then there's unwinding and investigation. And I think, one thing that I would be interested to get your perspective on is, and this is a little bit of related to my own self reflections, is where do you think the motive or drive originates to do this crazy, highly low odds of success thing called entrepreneurship? Is that something, are entrepreneurs born or are they made?
Born. I think
Mm.
that that's indisputable. What is also true is that people who are born to be entrepreneurs will do better if they get coaching, mentoring, business education, you know, consultation, enrichment around, entrepreneurship skills. And what's also true is that people who are born to be entrepreneurs will do better if they live in an environment that has a lot of resources that support entrepreneurship. Like Silicon Valley is great because in Northern California we have universities that have these great departments full of experts, and we have ecosystems that support biotech and high tech and fintech and all different kinds of growth areas. And we have a lot of access to nature. Nature exposure is very important for both mood and creativity. And we have communities of interest so that people don't feel so alone. So if you're born to be an entrepreneur and you have access to the right kind of training and professional development resources, and you live in the right place at the right time where there's a lot of money around so people can invest, and there's a lot of opportunities around because the world just discovered AI, then you're more likely to have a good run. But I suppose you're wondering, if you're not born to be an entrepreneur, should you just hang it up? And the answer to that is no. That people who do not have that DNA can also be entrepreneurs. Don't worry about it. You just have to make sure you understand yourself properly, understand what's required, and find workarounds so that you can succeed.
That makes sense to me. And I think the other thing too is there's also many flavors of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship doesn't always mean going and raising venture capital funding and all the pressure and stress of trying to do a hyper growth company. There's other ways to do it. And I think what I see is a lot of people that have been doing this for a while are finding their kind of founder on company type fit after they've been in it a little bit, and kind of just figuring out what's actually the best fit for their life, and as part of that, their well-being.
That's a great point, Scott, because in research, we define an entrepreneur as someone who is self-employed with or without employees. So that encompasses a broad range of people. Only a thin slice of that population gets money through investors. Maybe a wider slice gets money from bank loans, but the same DNA is found through that entire population. And so why is it that some people build these growth companies and others don't? Other than being at the right place at the right time, there are factors that are sort of beyond your control. For example, if it's been demonstrated that if a male founder and a female founder take the same business plan to an investor or a bank, the male founder is more likely to get funded and the female founder is less likely to get funded. So that's the sociology we live in, and it's just a way of illustrating that there are many factors that are beyond the control of the founder that have to do with who ends up growing, whose company ends up growing, at what rate.
Yeah,
The
that's interesting.
average, it is the average self-employed person has about 2 to 3 employees. In the state of California, 11% of the workforce is 11% of people who work are self-employed, and with 2 or 3 employees, it's at least 30% of all jobs, if not more, are attributable to entrepreneurs. So it's basically impossible for economies to function. Modern economies cannot function without entrepreneurs. And what's even more important is that 80% of net new jobs are created by companies that are less than 5 years old. So in terms of where the job's coming from, where's the growth coming from, where is the high compensation for employed people coming from, also the entrepreneurs.
Well, yeah, I think it's a very compelling case about the importance to keep these people happy and healthy. One of the things that
that's my point, Scott, because the social benefits of entrepreneurship are so great that when you think about investing in the well-being and mental health of entrepreneurs, you're also investing in what they call spillover effects or ripple effects. That if an entrepreneur doesn't derail because they didn't get depressed, that means a lot of people didn't lose their jobs. So we have to put that in the equation.
Yeah, I mean, 30% of the jobs is that's a large proportion. Do you think that the audience of entrepreneurs is aware that they need this type of support in their experience?
Many are. Yes, many are. I don't know. There's a difference between need and demand, of course. So a lot of entrepreneurs may know that they need the support, but they may not ask for the support because they have to overcome shame and stigma or other barriers to access. But I think it's hard to find an entrepreneur who won't, if you ask them, won't tell you that they've been on the emotional roller coaster. And when you ask, sometimes in a workshop, I have led workshops that were sponsored by either incubators, accelerators, entrepreneurship networks, VC firms. And sometimes in a workshop, if I ask about like, what was your worst experience as an entrepreneur, the stories you hear are really quite traumatic. There have been some very significant wipeouts. In fact, another study looked at the long-term consequences of bankruptcy. And what the findings illustrated was that many people have mental health impairments, such as depression, from after a bankruptcy that can go on for 4 or 5 years. And in some cases, they never remit.
Wow.
So the need is out there. In our research, we identified that 38% of the entrepreneurs we studied have one or more diagnosable mental health conditions. So need is definitely out there.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's a proportion of people that understand this. There's some people that maybe understand it, are afraid to take action. Is there any research that talks about when there is a mental health support infrastructure, how that results in affects the success of the entrepreneur or longevity in entrepreneurship, or anything that points to the efficacy?
That's the study that I would like to conduct. That study has not been done yet. Studies of that nature have been done with respect to other occupational groups, like managers, for example. So, I think it's been pretty well established that social and occupational functioning across the board is improved by proper mental health care. But dialing it in specifically with a group of entrepreneurs, that one has not been done. And anybody who is listening, who is interested in supporting research of this nature, let me know, because that kind of research needs to be supported.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that we talked a little bit about before the show, which kind of dovetails in this point, is that there seems to at time be a lot of people that are pretty loud about the importance of mental health. But at the same time, they want their entrepreneurs to be working to the bone. I'm looking at you, investors. And so, what is the current dynamic that you see there, where there's incentive for well-being that could result in good outcomes, but there still might be kind of an old school mentality that things like balance, things like taking vacations, not working all the time, having a life outside your company might actually not be in the best interest of financial returns?
That's the equation that everybody in this process really needs to think through, the investors and the entrepreneurs. But my experience has been very much what you said, that there are more and more and more investors discussing the importance of mental health, but very few actually doing anything to support the mental health of entrepreneurs. I mentioned, research budgets. I'm putting together a research budget right now for a project that really has the potential to be quite impactful. And I've been discouraged by how disinterested the VC community members that I've spoken to are in actually supporting that kind of thing. There are a lot of reasons why they don't want to support it. Number one, these funds tend to be like 5 years long. And if you invest in the mental health of an entrepreneur, the return on that investment sometimes comes back in year 6, year 7, year 8. And so that is not going to go to the bottom line of the venture partners. Another reason is that the structure of these venture funds is such that they expect 80% of the companies to fail. And they expect 10% to neither fail nor succeed. And then they expect another 5% to succeed, but, nothing to write home about in terms of returns. And then that last little margin, the ones that maybe 5%, 4%, 3% that knock it out of the park, that's where the venture funds make all of their upside. And so since there are so many people that are knocking on their door and want to be entrepreneurs and want to get funding, they feel like they have like this unlimited sort of supply of would-be founders to choose from. So why should they expend resources on those in that 80% that are going to fail anyway? That's the thought pattern that I've encountered. Now, it's not universally true. I have had consulting contracts with venture capital firms here and there that really do want to do something about it. So I'm beginning to see some movement, but by and large, there's been a lot of resistance.
Yeah. The hits-driven model is not conducive to everyone getting a built-in therapist, I guess. It's just the economics just aren't attractive.
So entrepreneurship is very emotional, as you know, and the technical word for it is emotional labor. What kind of work do entrepreneurs do? They do emotional labor. They regulate their own emotions. They carefully select which emotions to transmit when they're talking with various audiences. They tune into the emotions of the people on their team, and they help those with good, emotional IQ. They help team members navigate emotions as well. And if you look at this kind of supply and demand issue, at least to me, because I grew up in Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, and Beverly Hills is all about show business. And what I recognize is that the relationship between the VCs and the entrepreneurs is very similar to the relationship between the producers and the actors. That there are million actors that want to get parts, and so the producers kind of have their pick, and they often believe that they can dictate the terms. There's a difference, though, between the screen actors and the entrepreneurs in that the screen actors have a labor union. It's called the Screen Actors Guild, and they're about to go out on strike. But there's no such thing as a labor union for entrepreneurs. But my theory is that with all this emotional labor, that the entrepreneurs need something like an emotional labor union in order to be able, as a group, to bring some of these issues to the table with the investors. I don't know if that idea is going to ever get anywhere, but if it doesn't, it's you're relying on the goodwill of the particular investors that you happen to be lined up with.
I did see something called like Founder's Pledge that I signed that I don't know really even what it was, but it seemed to be some type of coalition to bring awareness to this. I don't know that was a unified front of any sort, though.
It did illustrate that there's a lot of goodwill out there. That was a gentleman named Naveed Lalani who runs a company called Pioneer Mind. And when Silicon Valley Bank imploded, many entrepreneurs went into crisis mode because their companies were highly at risk. And I think highly of Naveed and his work, and I collaborate with him on things like the Founders Pledge, and hopefully we'll see. Hopefully we can take that momentum and build upon it, because the investors themselves they're many of them are really good people, and they were entrepreneurs themselves early in life, and they're just kind of stymied about how to move this agenda forward. So hopefully if we come up with some good solutions, we can get some buy-in.
Well, I'm optimistic as well. And I think, shifting gears a little bit, I would be curious, like, what are, in terms of patterns, you mentioned you've worked thousands of hours with entrepreneurs. Are there any commonalities, main commonalities that you see of the problems that these people come to you with, and then solutions that seem to work for people?
Yes, there are definite commonalities. First of all, there's a suite of mental health conditions that are more common among entrepreneurs. And there's a suite of personality traits that are more common among entrepreneurs. And the unifying theme in all of that is dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter and neuromodulator that is associated with rewards. And it coordinates a lot of emotions and behaviors that are related to novelty seeking, stimulus seeking, reward seeking, goal oriented behavior and pleasure. And these entrepreneur personality traits tend to reflect dopamine differences. And so what are those personality traits? One of them is open-mindedness, openness to having new experiences, and openness to considering all kinds of different ideas, and being tolerant of other people, and having more liberal values, and not shutting down channels where you might find out something important. And appreciation of aesthetics and different kinds of experiences, sensuality. Another one is intellect. Entrepreneurs are kind of smarter than the average bear. They don't necessarily get good grades. There might be the B students who hire the A students, but nonetheless, they have street smarts, and that is very helpful for them in building and growing businesses as well. And another one of those personality traits is called extroversion. These are people that are outgoing, enthusiastic. They like to kind of be dominant. They gravitate towards roles of leadership, and they are also, highly motivated, and they energized by excitement and by people. And then that industriousness, that compulsive thing I talked about before, kind of an orientation towards really going into flow mode, getting stuff done. So when those superpowers bleed over into mental health conditions, it's more associated with ADHD, for example, is rather common among entrepreneurs. Bipolar spectrum conditions are more common among entrepreneurs. This obsessive compulsive personality driven workaholic thing is more common among entrepreneurs. And some of the behavioral addictions, can be more common among entrepreneurs as well. So that, I would say, that's kind of the footprint, if you will. But entrepreneurs have they have garden variety anxiety and depression too. It's not like they don't have the kind of problems other people have, but they do tend to be tilted in that direction.
And do you find that most people are able to identify what is off, or they just know that something is off?
They just know that something's off. I can't tell you how many times I've completed an evaluation of a new person I've just met in my practice, and at the end of that, I tell them that they actually have ADHD. And these people in their 30s, 40s, 50s even, who always knew that they were different, but they didn't know it was ADHD. And as soon as you put it together that way, all kinds of things begin to make sense. Bipolar spectrum as well. I'm sure, Scott, you are familiar with the kind of the warmth and the enthusiasm and the energy that you find when you get a bunch of entrepreneurs together. And a bunch of them are actually hypomanic, and you probably could go around the room and identify who that might be. And some of those ones who are hypomanic over time actually do become bipolar. We have this, my research colleagues and I have this test, a written test. You can look it up on the internet. It's called the Hypomanic Personality Scale. It's a validated assessment instrument for hypomania. And if you score at a certain threshold, then you have a 1 in 5 chance of actually having a manic depressive episode within 5 years. So you're more heavily loaded for that. So to answer your question, a lot of times people know that they're different in some way, but they can't really put their finger on what it is.
Yeah, and that definitely resonates for me personally, is I've had a number of things that, you just think that's the way things are. And then you take someone else telling you that, hey, that's not normal. And or it doesn't have to be like that if you don't want it to be. Which is certainly, certainly very eye-opening. One thing that you mentioned is scalable solutions to this. And I actually wasn't even aware that there's a shortage of mental health workers I guess, out there right now. So I would be interested to get your perspective on, the color on the existing scenario, and what are the types of interventions that you think might need to exist or be created or supported to help remediate some of these challenges?
That's a very good question. And I didn't mention this earlier, but when I was in my entrepreneur phase, I was actually launching health insurance companies. And I would be founding chief medical officer of building a specialized mental health insurance company that includes an employee assistance program. And so these would grow to have millions and millions of members. So I got to know the mental health system very well through that process. And unfortunately, it hasn't gotten much better over time. I think what you should know as an entrepreneur is that if you do need mental health support, that means you're normal. Mental health differences are normal for entrepreneurs. You should not in any way resist asking for help because it might be embarrassing, or if you're worried how other people might think about it. Just to digress on that for a second, Scott, in most instances, about 2/3 of entrepreneurs are men and about 1/3 are women. At least that's how it is in California, but I think in European countries as well. In my practice, about half the people I work with are women. So women are overrepresented in my practice, women founders. Why is that? I think it's because women might be more comfortable asking for help than men, just culturally. So for the guys out there, if you feel like you're hitting a wall and you're having some early warning signs, definitely feel free about reaching out. Now, once you reach out, who do you reach out to? Some conditions are more like personal and psychological. Like, for example, the email I got from this woman founder who is wondering whether or not she should divorce her husband, the workaholic. I would say a licensed psychologist, social worker, marriage and family therapist who really understands family issues and relationship issues would, in that sense, be good. But what about her husband, who seems to have who knows what going on, but it seems to include variations on the theme of addiction and insomnia and compulsive behavior. If you have symptoms that are more disruptive, that are intrusive, if you can find a psychiatrist to evaluate that, at least as a place to start, I would recommend it, because for many of these conditions like ADHD or like bipolar spectrum or like depression or like panic attacks and anxiety, medication can make a difference, and it's the MD psychiatrist who will understand how to navigate that piece of it. Doesn't mean other kinds of therapists aren't also helpful, but I would make sure to include that on your list. So then the next question is, what kind of therapy should you be seeking? And I would really emphasize evidence-based care. Evidence-based care, that's interventions and different kinds of support that have been researched and that are known to be effective. Unfortunately, because of the history of how mental health clinicians in training came to be, for a lot of the people who were not trained recently, they learned about different schools of therapy that were not particularly evidence-based. So focus on evidence-based approaches to anxiety, evidence-based approaches to bipolar or ADHD, depression, whatever it is. And then in terms of scalable, that's what I'm trying to build. It's been really hard to round up resources to build that. But just things like this podcast would be an example of something that's scalable. If a bunch of people, a bunch of entrepreneurs listen to this and some of them identify things that they've experienced by listening, then you're having, then this actually becomes a scalable piece of a scalable solution.
Yeah, and I think living in the digital age, there is the infrastructure to do more of that. It's just, how do the existing solutions and new solutions reach the right people at the right time before there's an implosion, which happens. I think one thing that I've seen with a lot of entrepreneurs is there's a resistance to go there, to do the inner work, because they're afraid that it's going to make them soft or that they're going to lose their edge. I've heard a number of times. And
so I'll ask you a question. You're a successful entrepreneur who has made it a priority to go through a process that leads you to have a greater sense of well-being in your life. What worked for you? How did you overcome that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, to be honest, I think it was actually something my mom said to me that really kind of rattled me, where she's like, you often don't know that you're not happy, because the thing is it's like a slow gradient of change, both in, your joy and your stress, and it just compounds over years. And my mom said something like, man, like, you used to be such a goofball in high school, like, so kind of joyous and silly, and like, you're so intense. And yeah, it just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks, where I was like, shit, like, she's right. And I think there was a moment where I'm like, well, the whole reason I became an entrepreneur, I thought, was so that I could do whatever I want. And I'm not doing what I want. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how I got here. Kind of experience is like, how the hell did I get here? How did I end up here? And also a sense of like, I thought that I had done everything right, and was a little bit confused and angry about why I wasn't happy, right? Like, I went to the right school, I started the company, right investors, success, blah, blah, blah. And yet, I was intense. I was very intense. And so all of that kind of, I think brought things to a head for me.
So a loved one kind of snapped you out of it. Your mom, I say, go mom. And let's put your mom on the podcast at some point.
Yeah.
But what she said effectively was, Scott, do you have a career, or does your career have you? Are you running a company, or is the company running you? And that dilemma is not uncommon among entrepreneurs. When you are pursuing a goal, the brain of the entrepreneur has this unusual setting called reward sensitivity. And what that means is that for entrepreneurs, good news is experienced as being better than it really is. And bad news is experienced as being worse than it really is. And there's another setting that a bunch of settings that have to do with goal pursuit, goal-focused behavior. And the entrepreneurs are much more persistent in trying to achieve goals than almost anybody else would be. It's unbelievable, and I'm guilty as charged because...
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. I keep persisting in trying to solve this problem, even though I'm not getting the warm, fuzzy feedback from the ecosystem. But when you are in the grips of this kind of goal engagement, goal persistence, goal pursuit, you lose that ability to turn off the switch and go play Frisbee or whatever it is you used to do when you were in high school, And when the ups are ups and the downs are downs, you kind of go into crisis mode either way. If the ups are ups, you go into urgency mode to get more of what just worked. And if the down is really down, you go into crisis mode to get out of it as quickly as you can.
Yeah, no, it sounds very familiar. And I think for a lot of us, myself included, the way to get out of that was, the reliable reward mechanism of working. I'm like, all right, cool. I'm going to throw myself into this. If I get some things done on my to-do list, I feel good, and I don't have to.
This is where it becomes an addiction, because the definition of an addiction is anything where you need more and more and more and more to get the same result. And people get to that point where it's hard to turn it off.
Yeah. Well, eventually there's a bill to pay. At least
yes,
that's my experience. And, my hope with these types of conversations is kind of those early warning signs, right? And an openness.
Yes, when your mother starts ragging on you, that is called an early warning sign.
You hear that, everybody? So if mom's giving you shit, go see Dr.
Early
Freeman
warning
or
sign.
someone
That's
else.
right.
Is there anything that you're particularly excited about in the mental health industry right now as it's germane to this conversation?
Well, yeah, one thing I'm excited about is that there's some low-tech solutions everybody can easily implement that are free, that go a long way to helping you be well, And resilience is very important, because the higher your level of well-being, the less likely it is that you will have any kind of mental health issue. So the leverage point in this equation is focus on your own wellness, and that will be a big, big buffer for you. So what's on the free to-do list? One of those things is sleep. It seems obvious, but, again, this is where your mother comes in, that, yes, there is a bedtime, and it's not 3 a.m. So, put that on your list, get regular good night's sleep, and you have solved a lot of problems right there. Another is exercise. I really work that in every day, and both resistance training and aerobic exercise are very good mood elevators. There have been many studies comparing exercise with antidepressants in these head-to-head trials, and exercise turns out to be as good as any antidepressant. So
Wow.
that's free, and in terms of the side effect profile of exercise, it's way better than the side effect profile of antidepressants. So I'd work that one in. I mentioned nature exposure before. This also has been a lot of research on this. We humans live in a world for which we are not biologically pre-adapted. We're pre-adapted to be hunter-gatherer nomads in outdoor green environments with very little time spent indoors. And when indoors, that means a teepee or a hut or something like that. So get outdoors as much as you can. The greener or the bluer, the better. Just living near a park improves your mental health. Even if you never go there, you just have to walk by it on the way to the store, and all of a sudden you're better. In fact, even looking out the window at something green improves your mental health. And if you're somebody with ADHD, having a plant in your office improves your mental health. So don't forget that we are part of the natural world. That's another freebie. Having at least one interest that has nothing to do with work, like you're interested in rock climbing, or you're interested in classical music, or you're interested in, some history of the French Revolution, or you're interested in, quilting or cooking, whatever has some interest that has nothing to do with work, so that you can get passionate about something that isn't work. And then the other thing on that list is all those friends and family who are not entrepreneurs. Those, you've got to really nourish those relationships and keep those alive as well, because those are the people who you can turn to when the chips are down, and those are the people who will give you honest feedback. And those are the people where you can be in an equal relationship. When you're running your business, it is not an equal relationship. In fact, one of the reasons co-founders get into trouble is because they start out being friends, and the relationship between friends is very different than the relationship between people who are in business together. So you want to be in some of those friend and family kind of relationships that have nothing to do with work as well. So I get excited about the fact that there are a lot of things that do not require an app that can make you a happier person.
Yeah, that's a great list. And, definitely things that stood out to me are having a hobby outside of work, and maybe even outside of self-improvement, because I know that's another trap where it's like, oh, my hobby's being in perfect shape, or something like that, like having something that's just not oriented in that direction. And yeah, I mean, I think I've noticed, like, in my experience, if all your friends are entrepreneurs, you're just going to be talking about how your companies are doing. It's going to be easy to fall into games of comparison. And, it can exacerbate things if you're not in a well state. So I think that's
Exactly.
really sound advice.
Exactly. Yes. What's going on in healthcare right now, and mental health as well, is called social determinants of health. We used to think that health problems and mental health problems were something that happened within the individual. But it turns out that while that's true to a certain extent, the world you live in and the world you grow up in also increases your vulnerability to health problems. For example, I had this experience where I was having lunch with a friend of mine at a little cafe in San Francisco. And from where we sat, we had a table in the window. From where we sat, we could see 5 different places where you could buy alcohol. Just
Wow.
so let's say you're somebody who's predisposed to addiction. Whether or not you actually become an addict is in part contingent upon the situation that you grow up in. That's called social determinants of health. I just told you that nature exposure is a mood stabilizer. Well, what if you happen to live in some kind of urban inner city core where there is really no access to nature? That is a social determinant of mental health. So I think that's exciting. As it pertains to entrepreneurship, I think the more we understand about what are the characteristics of fertile ecosystems. What does that mean? Fertility, that means birth rate. And why is it that the birth rate of new companies is higher in some ecosystems as opposed to other ecosystems? There's social determinants of entrepreneurship as well. The more we get that, the more we'll be able to support entrepreneurship and increase the likelihood that new companies will be formed.
Yeah. And one thing that sticks out to me as you're talking is you can start a company. It's easier to start a company anywhere today than it used to be. In places where there is more access to nature, there's sunlight, better food options. If you wanted to start a company in the wilderness, living in the middle of Montana or something before the pandemic, it would probably be harder than it is today. And that's not to say that's a decision that's for everybody. But there is more optionality to have some of these kind of net positive free components available to people.
Well, yes and no. If you are in the LGBTQ community and you're in Whitefish, Montana, you might not get the same kind of reception for your company that you do in San Francisco. And I can say, being a psychiatrist in San Francisco, that I worked with a ton of outstanding LGBTQ business founders with great companies that had to leave Oklahoma and Tennessee and Alabama and places where they just were not accepted. Think about how much Tim Cook has done for Silicon Valley, and think about how much Alabama lost out on when he left a state that just is not LGBTQ friendly. So yeah, you can do a lot of things almost anywhere in the world right now, but there's also a cultural fit, and there is what they call a macro psychology of ecosystems. And if you remember the personality traits I told you about of entrepreneurs, when you get a lot of entrepreneurs together in an ecosystem like where you live in Austin, Texas, then the region itself develops a personality. And the personality of Austin, Texas is like radically different than the personality of Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, and a lot of these other cities in Texas. And so there's probably a reason why you live in Austin and you don't live in Houston. And so the culture of the ecosystems do matter. The culture does matter.
Yeah, I think there's some good call outs there. I think, people need to be self-aware of what is going to feed them, like what is going to nurture them. And some places nurture other people better than others.
Yeah, like I have a colleague over in Tokyo, and she runs a mental health clinic, if you will, for entrepreneurs. In Japan, being an entrepreneur is frowned upon. It's looked down upon because it's individualistic, and it doesn't really follow a set pathway through adulthood and through career. And there's some shame and stigma associated with with it over there. And so it's very difficult emotionally for these Japanese entrepreneurs to relate to their friends and family and community. If you look at immigrants, people who come to the United States, we have a lot of immigrants, in my opinion, fortunately. And new businesses it's more likely that a new business will be started by an immigrant than by somebody who grew up here. And a lot of the immigrants who come here are coming to seek a culture in which they fit better. There are anthropologists talk about two different kinds of cultures, individualistic and collectivistic. So that Japanese culture is more collectivistic. It's where the community norms are enforced more strictly. And many immigrants who want to start businesses come to America from a collectivistic culture to land someplace that's more individualistic, where they can pursue an individual dream.
Yeah, and I think the U.S. is a great place for that, which makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it's the land of opportunity, right? And I think it still is. And I think I feel very lucky and blessed that we live in a place it's the easiest place to start a business.
Canada is beginning to eat our lunch a little bit. So I would say, for the policymakers who are listening out there, we are making some mistakes in terms of immigration policy when it comes to economic growth. And the Canadians are not making those mistakes.
Could you be specific there? I'm actually pretty interested.
Well, I mean, this whole policy of excluding as many immigrants as you can and making it very difficult for people who have knowledge, skills, education, networks, relationships, ideas to come to America or stay in America, I think is problematic. And Canada, on the other hand, Canada had more immigrants last year than any other country in the world. They're opening the borders to immigrants, and they're particularly opening the borders and supporting immigrants that want to start companies and entrepreneurs, developing very robust ecosystems with all kinds of supports. I met last week with a C-level executive from a Canadian national bank that either invests in or loans money to 95,000 companies in Canada. And they have implemented a mental health support program for 95,000 companies in Canada. I cannot point to an example of that happening anywhere in the United States. They're thinking about it. Check out the Toronto ecosystem, what's going on over there. It's amazing.
Wow, that's very cool. That's new information to me. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Freeman, this has been a fantastic conversation. Is there any, I love the free resources that people should look into. Obviously, we'll link your website and ways for people to kind of follow your work. Is there any other, resources that you think people should be aware of if they're listening to this conversation and a lot of what we discuss resonates?
I have some listed on my website. It's econa.net, econa.net. But it's really, right now, it's hit and miss. I would say if anybody who is listening who wants to collaborate to build resources like this for entrepreneurs, let me know, because there's a lot of work to be done there. But as I said, you can look in a variety of places. Podcasts, YouTube channels, as well as print media. I would just say make sure to focus on evidence-based self-care strategies as you begin to go down that route.
I think that's great advice. And for everybody listening, I'll make sure to link out Dr. Freeman's website that you can check out in the show notes. And thanks again. This was really wonderful. And, you know, I think I can speak for many entrepreneurs that I know that we're grateful for you bringing these conversations to the forefront and helping in the ways that you and your colleagues do. It's very needed and very appreciated.
Well, I appreciate it a lot too, Scott, that you are, as an entrepreneur, opening up this conversation, because it's really the role modeling from founders who accept that mental health differences are normal for entrepreneurs and are willing to talk about it and willing to support other people who are on that journey, that is going to make a difference in the long run. So thanks for inviting me onto this podcast, and thanks for producing it and making it available to your community. Really appreciate it.
You got it. And thank you everybody for listening. We will see you all on the next episode.